The alarm on my wrist buzzed twice, then stopped. That was wrong. It always buzzed 3 times. I was standing in the ration line at Haldor's Reach, our small outpost tucked between 2 moons nobody back on Earth had bothered to name properly, when I felt the silence behind me. Not quiet. Silence. The kind that happens when a room full of people all stop breathing at the same moment. I turned around, and there was a stranger standing where the door used to be open. He was tall in a way that made my neck hurt just looking at him, with skin the color of wet stone and eyes that did not blink. He wore a long gray coat that did not move even though the vents above the door were still pushing air. I remember thinking, stupidly, that he looked like a photograph of a person rather than an actual person. Something about him refused to fit into the room. Nobody said anything. Lucy Bennett, standing next to me with a tray of gray protein cubes, dropped her fork. It hit the floor and the sound of it seemed to last far too long. "I am looking for the one called Peter Lang," the stranger said. His voice had no accent I recognized, which somehow made it worse. It sounded like it had been built rather than born. I knew that name. Everyone on the Reach knew that name. Peter Lang was our commander, a quiet man who had been with the colony since the first landing party set foot on this rock 9 years ago. He was in the command building, 300 meters north, going over supply reports like he did every single day. Nobody answered the stranger. He tilted his head, studying the room the way you might study a puzzle you already knew the answer to. "None of you will tell me. That is acceptable. I already know." And then he was gone. Not walked out. Gone. 1 second he stood in the doorway, and the next the doorway was just a doorway again, and cold air was pouring in from outside. I want to tell you that I was brave in that moment, that I ran after him, that I did something heroic. The truth is I stood there with my tray shaking in my hands, and it was Lucy who grabbed my arm and said the only sensible thing anyone said that whole day. "That's an Asheville." I had heard the name before, the way you hear about a disease that only happens to other people. The Asheville were the Galactic Council's oldest order, older than most of the species sitting on the council itself. Nobody knew exactly how they were made or trained or chosen. What everyone knew, every single species from here to the council's core worlds, was this: if the Asheville were sent for you, you were already gone. 900 cycles of missions. Not one target had ever survived. Not one had ever even been rescued in time. Some species did not even bother resisting anymore. They simply accepted it the way you accept weather. I did not know any of that history in that moment. I only knew that something had just walked into our ration hall like it owned the air we were breathing, and it was looking for the man who ran our entire colony. We ran. Lucy and I burst out of the hall and into the cold wind of the Reach, our boots slipping on the metal walkway that connected the housing pods to the command building. I remember shouting Peter's name into my comm, getting nothing but static, and I remember Lucy grabbing a fire extinguisher off the wall as we ran, which even in the moment struck me as both useless and somehow exactly right. We were not soldiers. That is the first thing you need to understand about Haldor's Reach. We were farmers, engineers, water reclamation technicians, a handful of retired military advisors who mostly spent their days fixing broken irrigation lines. We had exactly one working defense turret, and it had been offline for 3 weeks waiting on a part that still had not arrived from the supply convoy. We were not ready for this. Nobody had told us we needed to be. The command building's door was already open when we reached it, hanging slightly off one hinge. Inside, the lights flickered. Peter Lang was standing behind his desk, very still, both hands flat on the surface in front of him. Across from him stood the stranger. "Peter," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. The stranger did not turn around. "You should not have followed. This does not concern you." "He's our commander," Lucy said, stepping half in front of me with the fire extinguisher raised like it was a weapon that could do anything at all. It concerns all of us. For the first time, something in the stranger's posture shifted. It was small, almost nothing, but I noticed it. A kind of recalculation. "You are protecting him," the stranger said slowly, like he was working through an equation that did not balance. "There is no tactical advantage in this. He holds no genetic value to your species. He commands no army that could resist me. Explain your reasoning." I did not understand the question. Not really, not then. "He's our friend," I said. It was the only answer I had. The stranger, who I would later learn was called Threnvas, actually paused at that. A full second of stillness, longer than anything else he had done since walking through our door. It was as if the words did not compute, as if I had spoken in a language his translator could hear but not process. "Friendship is not a survival strategy," he said finally. "Maybe not for you," I said. I do not know where the courage came from. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count since, lying awake on nights when the wind outside sounds too much like a door opening that should not be opening. I think now that it was not courage at all. It was simple refusal. The same stubborn refusal that had gotten my grandparents through a war they should not have survived, that had gotten the first colonists through a landing that killed a third of their ships, that runs through us like water runs through stone, wearing away at anything that tells us to stop. Threnvas moved. I will not describe every detail of what happened in the next 90 seconds, because most of it happened too fast for me to properly understand, even now. I remember the lights dying. I remember Peter shouting something and shoving his desk forward hard into the open space of the room. I remember Lucy swinging the extinguisher and the sound it made connecting with something that was not quite solid and not quite empty. I remember the smell of ozone, sharp and wrong, filling the small room. What I remember most clearly is the cold logic behind every one of Threnvas's movements. He moved like a machine that had already calculated every possible outcome, like there was no version of this fight he had not already played out 1,000 times in his mind before it began. Every step Peter took, Threnvas seemed to already know. Every swing Lucy made, he was already somewhere else. Except once. It happened when I threw the only thing within reach, a heavy data tablet from Peter's desk, not at Threnvas but past him, toward the emergency shutdown panel on the far wall. I was not aiming to hurt him. I was aiming to kill the lights entirely, to plunge the room into total darkness, because I remembered something one of our old military advisors used to say. Take away what he expects, and even the best plan falls apart. The tablet hit the panel, the room went black. For one heartbeat, everything stopped. I do not know exactly what happened in that darkness. I know that when the emergency lighting kicked back on, dim and red, Threnvas was on the ground, and Peter was standing over him with a length of pipe in his hands, breathing hard, staring down at something he clearly had not expected to actually accomplish. Threnvas was still. He did not move again. None of us spoke for a long time. Lucy's hands were shaking so badly she dropped the extinguisher. Peter set the pipe down carefully, like it might still go off, like the danger had not actually passed just because the body on the floor had stopped being a threat. "We need to report this," Peter finally said, his voice hoarse. "The council needs to know what happened here." I remember laughing, a short broken sound that did not feel like laughter at all. "You think they'll believe us?" Peter looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I had never seen there before, something that had not existed in him an hour earlier, when supply reports were the biggest problem any of us had. "I don't think it matters whether they believe us," he said. "I think what matters is that we survived, and they need to understand that this is not going to be the last time they try." He was right, though none of us understood then just how right he was. We sent the report that night, describing everything, the arrival, the questions, the fight, the silence afterward. We did not expect a response for weeks. Communication across this much distance was never fast. The response came in 4 days, and it was short. 4 short sentences from someone on the council we would never meet, informing us that our report had been logged, that an investigation was pending, and that further contact would follow. What the message did not say, what we would only learn much later, was that somewhere far beyond our small stretch of stars, in rooms none of us would ever see, a debate had already begun. Not about whether Threnvos's failure was real, about whether it mattered. Most of the council, we later learned, dismissed it entirely. An accident, a malfunction in an aging operative. 900 cycles without failure does not end because of one report from a border colony too small to matter. That is what they told each other, in the calm, certain voices of people who have never once had to fight for anything they were not already promised. But not everyone dismissed it. There was one voice on the council, we would learn, that argued the opposite. That argued the report should be taken seriously, precisely because it made no sense. Species did not defeat the Asheville. It had never happened. Even if this was some strange accident, it deserved a second look, a confirmation, a certainty. They sent a second operative. I did not know any of this on the night we buried what was left of Threnvos outside the perimeter fence, in ground that had never held anything but irrigation pipes and colony equipment before. I did not know that our small victory, our desperate, lucky, unplanned survival, had just written our names into a debate happening in a language none of us spoke, in a place none of us would ever see. All I knew, standing there in the cold wind with Lucy on one side and Peter on the other, was that something had changed. We had wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to grow our crops and fix our water lines and live our small, quiet lives on the edge of everything. We had not asked to become a question the entire galaxy was suddenly trying to answer. But some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. And somewhere out among the stars, something patient and cold was already turning its attention toward us, deciding that one failure deserved a second, more certain answer. We had no idea what was coming. We only knew that whatever it was, we would not run from it. 3 weeks passed before the second one arrived. And in those 3 weeks, Haldor's reach changed in ways I would not have believed possible before that night in the command building. Peter Lang stopped sleeping in his quarters and started sleeping in the command building itself, on a cot pushed against the wall, close enough to the comm system that he could be awake and answering within seconds if anything happened. Lucy Bennett, who had spent her whole life working water reclamation systems, spent her evenings now studying old military manuals pulled from the colony archive, manuals nobody had opened in years because nobody had ever expected to need them. I found myself doing something I never expected either. I started walking the perimeter fence every night before I slept, just looking, just watching the dark tree line beyond our lights, though I could not have told you what I was looking for. Not really. I think I was simply trying to convince myself that watching mattered, that if something came again, I would see it coming this time. We built things too. Small things, nothing that would have impressed a real military engineer, but things that mattered to us. We rigged motion sensors along the fence line using spare parts from the water plant. We moved the one working defense turret's replacement part up the supply priority list, and when it finally arrived, 3 of our engineers worked through the night to install it. We drilled, badly at first, then less badly, the entire colony practicing what to do if the alarm sounded again. Peter called it preparation. I think, in the quiet parts of myself I did not say out loud, I called it waiting for something we all knew was coming. The second one arrived on a morning that started exactly like every other morning, which I have come to understand is simply how these things happen. There is no warning drum roll before disaster. It walks in wearing the same gray light as any ordinary day. I was in the greenhouse checking the irrigation lines when the motion sensors along the north fence went off. All at once, in a pattern our engineers had specifically built to distinguish between wildlife and something larger. I dropped my tools and ran, and by the time I reached the command building, half the colony was already gathering, and Peter was standing on the front steps with a rifle in his hands that I had never seen him carry before. The figure walking up the main path toward us moved differently than Thren Vos had. Where the first one had seemed to simply appear, this one walked with deliberate, unhurried steps, as though it wanted us to see it coming, as though the sight of it approaching was itself supposed to be a kind of weapon. It was shorter than Thren Vos, with a build like coiled wire, and its skin shifted color as it moved, a strange rippling pattern of gray and blue that made it difficult to look at directly. Its eyes, unlike the first one's flat black gaze, glowed faintly, a dim amber light that pulsed slowly, like something breathing. "I am called Keshrin," it said, its voice carrying easily across the open ground between us, though it had not raised it at all. "I have been sent to correct an error." Nobody moved. We had drilled for this. We had planned for this. And still, in the actual moment, every plan we had made felt impossibly small against the reality of that voice, that certainty. "You killed one of my order," Keshrin continued, stepping closer, unhurried, patient. "The Council believes this was an accident. I do not. I believe your species understood something about my kind that we did not expect. I intend to learn what that was before I complete my task." Peter's voice, when he answered, was steadier than I expected. "Then maybe you should listen instead of finishing your task." Keshrin tilted its head, the same small gesture Thren Vos had made in the command building 3 weeks earlier, the gesture of something processing information that did not fit its models. "Listening is not part of my function," it said, "but I am curious. Curiosity is permitted within limits." What followed was unlike anything I expected. Keshrin did not attack immediately. It walked the perimeter of our gathering, slow, watching, studying the fence lines we had reinforced, the turret we had repaired, the drilled positions our people had taken up without needing to be told. I understood, watching it, that this one was different. Thren Vos had underestimated us because it could not imagine a species like ours mattering enough to plan for. Keshrin was not making that mistake. "You have prepared," it said finally, stopping near the turret. "Interesting. Most species, upon losing one operative, either surrender entirely or flee. You have done neither. You have built defenses instead. Explain." I do not know what made me step forward. Maybe it was watching Peter and Lucy stand their ground. Or maybe it was something simpler, some old stubborn thread running through all of us that refused to let fear be the only answer we gave. "Because we're not going anywhere," I said. "This is our home." "A concept with no strategic value," Keshrin replied. "Territory can always be reclaimed elsewhere. Why remain and risk destruction for a location that holds no unique resource?" "Because it's ours," Lucy said, stepping up beside me. "You don't leave what's yours just because someone bigger tells you to." Something about that answer seemed to genuinely trouble Keshrin, more than any weapon we had built could have. It stood there a long moment, amber eyes pulsing slowly, and I understood, watching it, that we were looking at something that had spent its entire existence understanding the galaxy through the lens of advantage and calculation, and it simply did not have a framework for what we were saying. "This is not rational," it said almost to itself. "Maybe not," Peter said, "but it's true." Keshrin moved then, and this time there was no hesitation in it, no pause for further conversation. It came at Peter first, fast, faster than anything I had ever seen move, and I understood in that instant why 900 cycles of missions had ended the same way every single time. This was not a fight in any sense I understood the word. This was something closer to a storm deciding to notice you. Peter fired the rifle, and somehow, impossibly, Keshrin was no longer where the shot landed. It closed the distance in the space of a single breath, and Peter went down hard, the rifle skidding away across the ground. I do not remember deciding to move. I remember being suddenly between Keshrin and Peter's still body, with nothing in my hands but the small tool kit I had been carrying from the greenhouse, and I remember thinking, with a strange, calm clarity that still surprises me when I look back on it, that I was not going to win this by being stronger or faster or better trained. I was going to win this, if I won it at all, by being something Keshrin had never had to account for. You already lost one of your own to a species you don't understand, I said, forcing my voice to stay level even as every part of me wanted to run. What makes you think you understand us any better? It was not a clever line. It was not a plan. It was simply the truth spoken out loud, and for one crucial second it worked exactly the way the truth sometimes does. Keshrin paused, amber eyes narrowing, some deep and ancient part of its processing genuinely caught by the question, and in that pause our repaired turret, finally back online after 3 weeks of work, opened fire. It was not a killing shot. It was not meant to be. Our engineers had built it for defense, for holding a line, not for taking a life, and it caught Keshrin across one shoulder, spinning it hard into the dirt. What happened after that was not clean, and it was not something I like remembering in detail. I will only say that between the turret and Lucy's quick thinking with a live power cable pulled from the fence line, and the sheer desperate weight of an entire colony refusing to simply stand by and watch, Keshrin did not walk away from Haldor's reach. Peter survived. His injuries were serious, but our medical technicians working through the night kept him breathing, kept him with us. I sat beside his cot until dawn, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, thinking about the strange amber light in Keshrin's eyes and the way it had paused, actually paused, when I asked it a question it did not have an answer for. We sent our second report to the council the next morning. This one was longer than the first, more detailed, written with a kind of grim clarity none of us had possessed 3 weeks earlier. We described everything: the preparation, the defenses, the way Keshrin had hesitated, had genuinely tried to understand us before attempting to finish its task. I remember Peter, still weak, still recovering, insisting on adding one line to the end of the report himself, dictating it slowly while Lucy typed. We are not soldiers, and we did not ask for this, but we will not stop defending what is ours, no matter how many of your operatives you send. The response, when it came, took longer this time, 9 days instead of 4, and when it arrived, it was not the same short, dismissive message we had received before. It was a warning. The council, the message informed us, was now treating Haldor's reach as a matter of significant concern. 2 failed operations against a single colony of a previously unremarkable species was, in the council's own words, statistically impossible under any existing threat model. Further review was underway. Further action, the message made clear, should be expected. I remember reading those words standing beside Peter's cot, and I remember the strange, cold feeling that settled into my chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding, for the first time, the true size of what we had stumbled into. We had not asked to matter to the wider galaxy. We had only wanted to be left alone, to build our small lives on our small piece of ground, and to be allowed to keep them. But somewhere out among the stars, in rooms full of voices that had never once had to fight for anything, a decision was being made that we could not stop and could not influence. 2 failures were no longer an accident to be dismissed. 2 failures were a pattern, and patterns, to minds like the council's, demanded certainty. They were not going to send one operative next time. I did not know it then, standing in that quiet medical bay watching Peter breathe. But the galaxy's oldest order of silent killers had just decided that Haldor's reach was no longer a curiosity. It was a problem that needed to be solved completely. And they were about to send 3 of their very best to make absolutely certain it was solved. Peter recovered slowly, and while he did, the rest of us did not stop working. We understood now, in a way we had not understood after the first attack, that this was not going to end with a single conversation or a single fight. Whatever the council decided to send next, it would not be one operative walking calmly up our main path. It would be something bigger, and we needed to be ready for a version of ready that none of us had ever imagined needing. Lucy took charge of what she started calling our pattern problem. She had noticed something in both previous attacks that the rest of us had been too afraid to fully see. Both Threnvas and Keshrin had been defeated not by strength, not by superior weapons, but by moments that made no logical sense to them. My throwing a tablet at a shutdown panel instead of at the enemy directly. Peter and I refusing to abandon each other even when doing so might have been the safer choice. Lucy grabbing a live power cable without hesitation, an act that any sensible calculation would have called too dangerous to attempt. They think in probabilities, Lucy explained one evening, standing in front of a whiteboard covered in her own handwriting, addressing a room full of colonists who had never expected to be planning a defense against alien assassins. They calculate the most likely response and prepare for it. What they can't calculate is a species that keeps choosing the least likely response, because we're not choosing based on probability. We're choosing based on people, on what we owe each other. Peter, still moving carefully but back on his feet, nodded slowly from his seat near the front. So we lean into that. Every plan we make from here forward, we build around confusing their models, not overpowering their strength. We spent the following weeks doing exactly that. We spread ourselves out instead of consolidating, because a decentralized colony with dozens of separate decision-makers was far harder to predict than a single command structure that could simply be removed. We trained ordinary colonists, farmers and engineers and technicians who had never held a weapon with serious intent before, not to be soldiers, but to understand that their choices mattered, that hesitation born of fear was more dangerous than any mistake born of trying. We built false command centers, decoys scattered across the colony that looked, from a distance, exactly like the real command building. We buried emergency comm relays outside the main perimeter, so that even if the central system was destroyed, word could still travel. We turned our greenhouses into supply caches, our water towers into observation points, our entire ordinary daily life into something that looked, to anyone studying it carefully, like chaos, but was in fact a web of decisions no single strike could ever fully unravel. I did not think, during those weeks, that we were doing anything particularly clever. I only remember feeling that we were doing the only thing that made sense to us, which was refusing to be simple, refusing to be a single point that could be found and removed. They arrived on a night with no warning at all. Our motion sensors, the ones that had caught Keshrin from half a kilometer away, gave us nothing this time. The first sign anyone had was Lucy's voice over the comm system, calm and urgent at once, telling everyone that the North Water Tower's camera feed had gone dark exactly at the moment 3 figures appeared at its base. I was in the greenhouse when the alert came, and I remember the strange, sinking certainty that settled into my chest as I grabbed the emergency kit we had prepared weeks earlier and moved toward my assigned position, one of a dozen scattered points across the colony that Lucy's planning had built specifically for a night like this one. The 3 of them moved differently than either Threnvas or Keshrin had. They did not walk openly up the main path. They split apart the moment they crossed our perimeter, each one moving toward a different section of the colony, and I understood, watching the reports come in over comm from our scattered lookouts, that the Council had learned something from its previous failures after all. They were not going to give us a single target to focus our resistance against. They were going to divide us the same way we had tried to divide their expectations. The first, a tall figure with skin like pale ashen hands that moved too quickly to properly track, went for the command building, exactly as Threnvas had. What it found instead was an empty structure. Lights on, terminals active, giving every appearance of importance, while the real command decisions were being made from a reinforced storage bunker 200 meters away that Lucy had quietly converted weeks earlier. The second, a smaller figure whose voice, when it spoke, carried an odd metallic echo, moved toward the water towers, likely believing that cutting our water supply would force a concentration of defenders it could then overwhelm. What it found instead were 3 engineers who had spent the better part of a month rigging the towers with pressure release systems originally designed for emergency venting. Systems that, when triggered, released enough force to knock a grown man off his feet from 10 meters away. The third, the one I would come to know as Olaven, came for the greenhouses. I do not know if it was random chance or some calculation none of us understood that sent Olaven toward my position specifically. But I remember the moment the greenhouse door slid open on its own, the emergency lock we had installed apparently no obstacle at all, and a figure with deep violet eyes and a build like something built for silence stepped through into the warm, humid air. "You are the one who spoke to Keshrin," Olaven said, and there was something in its voice that had not been present in either of the previous 2, something that sounded almost like genuine interest. "Its final transmission before termination mentioned you specifically." I did not answer immediately. I was too busy triggering the small alert I had built into my wristband, a simple signal that would tell Lucy and the others where the third attacker had gone, and too busy trying to remember every single lesson we had spent the past weeks drilling into ourselves. Do not fight fair. Do not fight the way they expect. Confuse the probability. Choose the answer that makes no sense. "You've been sent to kill me," I said, keeping my voice steady even as my hands trembled around the small tool I had grabbed off the nearest workbench. "That's a strange way to start a conversation." "I am not required to kill efficiently," Olaven said, moving closer, unhurried, confident in a way that told me it had already decided how this was going to end. "I am required to understand. The Council does not yet know why your species defeats logic-based assessment. I intend to determine that answer before I complete my task." "Maybe there's nothing to understand," I said, backing slowly between 2 rows of irrigation lines, buying myself distance, buying myself time. "Maybe we just don't think the way you expect us to." "That is not an answer, that is an evasion." "Or maybe," I said, "it's the exact same thing you told me it was, an answer you don't have a category for yet." I do not know if it was the words themselves that mattered, or simply the act of talking, of stretching out the seconds while Lucy's team, alerted by my signal, closed the distance toward the greenhouse. What I know is that Olaven paused, violet eyes narrowing slightly, some deep and careful part of it weighing my words against everything it had been trained to expect, and in that pause, I did the only thing I could think to do. I grabbed the nearest irrigation control panel and triggered the emergency flood release, a system built to rapidly water an entire greenhouse section in the event of a fire, and sent a wall of water and mist crashing down between us. It was not a weapon. It was not meant to hurt anything, but for a creature built around precision, around reading intent and predicting movement with mechanical certainty, a sudden wall of water and confused visibility was exactly the kind of nonsense that Lucy had promised would work. Olaven hesitated, just for a moment, recalculating, and that moment was enough. 2 of our engineers, following the sound of the flood alarm, arrived at the greenhouse entrance with the same pressure release equipment that had already caught the second attacker at the water towers, and between the confusion, the water, and the sudden arrival of reinforcements, Olaven made the same mistake every previous operative had made. It underestimated how many of us were actually coming. I will not pretend the fight that followed was clean or simple. I will only say that by the time it ended, Olaven was down, not gone entirely, but disabled badly enough that our people were able to restrain it, something none of us had thought possible after everything Threnvas and Keshrin had shown us. Across the colony, word came in overcom that the first attacker had been driven back from the empty command building by a coordinated defense that used the false structure's very design against it, luring the figure into a corridor lined with the same pressure systems that had worked at the water towers, forcing a retreat that ended somewhere beyond our perimeter fence, into the dark tree line, where our people did not follow. The second attacker had fared worse. The water tower team, working together with a precision none of us had known we were capable of just months earlier, had managed to trap the smaller figure between two collapsing support struts deliberately weakened weeks in advance. An old trick from one of our retired military advisors, who remembered something about controlled structural collapse from a war fought decades before any of us were born. That attacker did not survive the encounter. By morning, we had one operative gone, one operative driven back beyond our fence, and one operative, Oliven, restrained, and for the first time since any of this began, alive and in our custody. Peter, still recovering but standing on his own now, came to see it personally, in the reinforced storage room we had converted into a holding space. I stood beside him, along with Lucy, watching Oliven sit motionless against the far wall, violet eyes tracking our every movement even as its body remained still. "You could have simply left," Peter said quietly. "After the water hit, you could have retreated like the first one did. Why did you stay?" Oliven was silent for a long moment. When it finally spoke, its voice had lost some of the cold confidence it carried during our earlier conversation. "Because I still do not understand," it said, "and my function requires understanding before termination. I have failed both requirements." "Maybe," Lucy said, "the answer was never something you could calculate. Maybe you had to actually live it to understand it." Oliven's violet eyes shifted toward her, something unreadable passing behind them. "That is not how my kind operates." "No," Peter said, "but it's how we operate, and that's exactly what none of you ever accounted for." We kept Oliven alive, under guard, for 3 more days before the Council's emergency communication came through, demanding the return of their operative under terms none of us were willing to accept. What none of us knew, until much later, was that Oliven itself had requested to send one final transmission back to its own people before any negotiation began, a request our communications team allowed, partly out of curiosity, partly because none of us saw the harm in it. I did not hear that transmission myself, not directly, but Lucy, monitoring the frequency, later told me exactly what Oliven said, word for word, and I have never forgotten it. "They do not fight like a species that wants to win. They fight like a species that has already decided it cannot lose. There is no threshold at which they surrender, no calculation that convinces them to stop. I do not believe further operations against them will succeed through force. I recommend the Council reconsider its assessment entirely." I remember Lucy reading those words to me in the quiet of the following morning, both of us standing outside the holding room, watching the sun rise over a colony that had, in the space of a few short months, gone from farmers and engineers to something else entirely, something that had looked directly at the galaxy's oldest and most feared order and simply refused to break. I did not feel triumphant hearing those words. I felt something closer to dread. Because I understood, even then, that a warning like that would not be received the way Oliven had intended it. To a council built entirely around calculation and certainty, a species that could not be predicted was not a species to be left alone. It was a species that needed to be understood completely, no matter what that understanding cost. And somewhere far beyond our small stretch of stars, in the same quiet rooms where our fate had already been debated twice before, a new and much larger conversation was beginning, one that would decide not just the future of Haldor's Reach, but the future of every human world the Council had not yet noticed. We had survived 3 of their best. We had no way of knowing, not yet, just how much further they were willing to go. We learned more from Oliven in the days that followed than any report, any sensor reading, or any prior encounter had given us. It did not share information willingly at first, but Peter, who had spent years before the colony working in negotiation roles for the old Earth government, understood something about patience that the rest of us were still learning. He visited the holding room every day, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to talk about nothing important at all, the weather patterns on Haldor's Reach, the way our crops grew differently here than they had back on Earth, small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with war or survival. I asked him once why he bothered, when Olaven so rarely responded. Because it's been trained its whole existence to expect one kind of behavior from a target, Peter said. Calculation, fear, negotiation built around advantage. I'm not giving it any of that. I'm just being a person. Sooner or later, that's going to matter more than it expects. He was right, though it took nearly 2 weeks before Olaven began speaking freely. What it told us, piece by piece, painted a picture of the Council that none of us had properly understood before. The Council was not one unified voice, as we had assumed. It was a fragile coalition of dozens of species, each with their own history, their own fears, held together by centuries of careful calculation and mutual predictability. Every species on the Council had, at some point in its history, been measured, understood, and placed into a category: aggressive but containable, passive but resource-rich, intelligent but slow to expand. Every category came with an expected response, a known set of rules for how that species would behave under pressure. Humanity did not fit any category they had ever built. Your species is what my order calls unmodeled, Olaven explained one afternoon, sitting across from Peter in the small holding room, its violet eyes steady in a way that had lost most of its earlier coldness. Every other species we have encountered eventually settles into predictable behavior once sufficient pressure is applied. Some surrender, some retaliate in calculated, proportional ways, some negotiate. All of them, eventually, behave according to models we have refined over thousands of cycles. And we don't, Peter said. You do not, Olaven agreed. You retaliate disproportionately when calculation would suggest surrender. You cooperate at moments when self-interest would suggest abandonment. You take risks that no rational calculation would support, and you do so consistently, not as an exception, but as your default behavior. This makes you dangerous in a way the Council has never had to categorize before. I remember asking, the one time I sat in on these conversations myself, why that made us dangerous at all. We were not building weapons meant to threaten the wider galaxy. We were not expanding aggressively into contested territory. We simply wanted to be left to live our lives. Olaven considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because unpredictability is the one thing a coalition like the Council cannot survive, it said finally. The entire structure depends on every member species trusting that every other member species will behave according to known patterns. A species that refuses to fit any pattern threatens that trust, whether it intends to or not. It is not your strength the Council fears. It is your unpredictability. That conversation stayed with me for a long time afterward. I understood, hearing it, that we had never needed to build armies or threaten anyone to become a problem in the Council's eyes. We had simply needed to exist as something they could not measure. While we learned this, the Council itself was having a conversation of its own, one we would only later reconstruct from fragments Olaven remembered and from records recovered much further into this conflict than I am able to describe here. I share what I can, understanding now that some of it came to us second-hand, through translation, through memory, through the imperfect process of piecing together events none of us witnessed directly. The debate, we learned, had split the Council into two clear positions. One side, led by voices that had built their entire careers on the certainty of calculated threat models, argued for immediate and overwhelming action. A species that could not be predicted was, in their view, a species that could not be trusted to remain contained. Better to remove the variable entirely before it grew large enough to threaten the wider structure the Council had spent centuries building. The other side, smaller but not silent, argued for something different. If three of the Council's most experienced operatives had failed against a colony as small and technologically unremarkable as Haldor's Reach, what confidence could anyone have that direct military action would succeed any better? Perhaps, this side argued, the correct response was not destruction but observation, understanding. A chance to actually learn what made this species behave the way it did, rather than simply trying to eliminate the variable through force. For a time, we learned that second argument held some ground. But arguments built on patience rarely survive contact with fear for very long, and fear, more than anything else, was what humanity had become to a council built entirely around the comfort of known outcomes. The final decision, when it came, was a compromise between the two positions, though not the kind of compromise that offered us any comfort. The Council would not yet commit to full military action against humanity as a whole. Too many of its own species remained unconvinced that a single colony's resistance represented a threat significant enough to justify open conflict. But they would authorize one final operation, a certainty operation they called it, meant to settle the question definitively, one way or another. They would send their oldest operative, the one whose designation had been retired from official records so long ago that even most of the Council's own historians were uncertain of its origins. The one known, in the few records that still mentioned it at all, only by the name that had followed it across every mission it had ever completed. The silence before Oliven's expression, when Peter finally asked it directly what it knew about this operative, was the closest thing to genuine fear I had seen from any of them since this entire ordeal began. I have never met it, Oliven admitted. Very few living operatives have. It does not train with the rest of my order. It does not report through the same channels. It is summoned only when the Council reaches genuine uncertainty, when every previous model has failed, and even then, only under direct authorization from the highest levels of Council leadership. What makes it different from the rest of you? I asked. Oliven was quiet for a long moment before answering. Every operative you have faced so far has approached your species as a puzzle to be solved through calculation, it said. The silence before does not calculate. It observes, for as long as necessary, sometimes for cycles at a time, until it understands its target completely. It has never failed a mission. Not once, in longer than most of my order's official records exist. I remember the silence that settled over the room after those words, a silence that felt different from any we had experienced before, heavier, colder, carrying the weight of something none of us fully understood yet, but all of us instinctively feared. Peter, to his credit, did not let that fear show in his voice when he finally spoke. Then, we prepared differently than we have before. We spent the following weeks doing exactly that, though preparation against an enemy none of us had ever seen, whose methods none of us understood, felt at times like trying to build a wall against weather we could not predict. Lucy expanded our decentralized defense network further, building redundancy on top of redundancy, ensuring that no single point of failure could bring down the entire colony's ability to respond. Peter reached out, for the first time, beyond Haldor's Reach itself, sending word to the handful of other human colonies scattered across this sector, warning them of what might be coming, sharing everything we had learned in case the Council's next target was not us at all, but somewhere else entirely. The response from those other colonies surprised me, though perhaps it should not have. Nobody hesitated. Nobody suggested that Haldor's Reach's fight was not their concern. Within days, small teams of volunteers began arriving from 3 neighboring settlements, engineers, technicians. A handful of retired soldiers who remembered wars fought long before any of us were born, all of them coming not because they had been ordered to, but because they understood, in the same instinctive way we did, that what threatened one human colony threatened all of them eventually. I asked Peter once, during those final weeks of preparation, whether he believed we could actually survive whatever was coming. He considered the question carefully before answering, the way he always did. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't think anyone can know that for certain, but I know we're not going to find out by giving up before it arrives. And I know that whatever this silence before turns out to be, it's going to have to work harder for this than anything it's ever faced before." I held onto those words in the days that followed, as our preparations continued, as more volunteers arrived, as Lucy's defense network grew more complex and more resilient with each passing day. I held on to them especially on the night, nearly a month after Oliven's transmission had gone out into the wider galaxy, when our long-range sensors picked up a single, small vessel entering our system, moving with a slow, patient deliberateness that felt, somehow, entirely different from anything that had come before it. It did not rush toward us the way Keshrin had walked up our main path. It did not divide into multiple approaches the way the three operatives before had. It simply drifted closer, unhurried, as if it had all the time in the galaxy to study exactly what it was approaching before deciding how to begin. I stood on the perimeter that night beside Peter and Lucy, watching that single point of light grow slowly brighter against the dark, and I understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy into my chest, that everything we had faced before this moment had only been a beginning. The Council had sent its very best against us, and it was almost here. Whatever happened next would decide everything. The vessel did not land the way the others had arrived. It settled quietly into the open field beyond our northern fence line, 3 days after our sensors first picked it up, and for those 3 days, it simply sat there, unmoving, giving no signal, no communication, nothing at all except its own patient presence hanging in the air like a held breath. We did not know what to make of the waiting. Lucy theorized it was studying us, gathering information the way Oliven had described, learning our patterns before making any move at all. Peter believed something similar, though he added a thought that stayed with me through those long, tense days. "Every operative before this one tried to solve us quickly," he said, standing with me on the perimeter fence, watching the distant shape of the vessel sitting motionless against the horizon. "This one isn't trying to solve us at all. I think it's trying to understand what we actually are before it decides anything." I asked him what he thought that meant for us. "I think it means we have time we didn't expect to have," he said, "and I think we should use every second of it." We did. Those 3 days were some of the longest I had ever lived through, each hour stretched thin with a tension that never quite broke, but we did not waste them. Lucy's team finished the last of our defense network expansions. The volunteers from neighboring colonies integrated fully into our watch rotations, learning the terrain, learning each other, becoming something closer to a single community than the separate settlements they had arrived from. Peter spent long hours in quiet conversation with Oliven, who remained in our custody, asking questions about what little the operative did know about the silence before, gathering every scrap of information we could find. What we learned was not much, but it was something. The silence before, according to the oldest fragments in Oliven's memory, had never once used overwhelming force to complete a mission. It did not rely on speed or strength or any of the calculated advantages the other operatives had brought against us. It relied entirely on understanding its target so completely that failure became, in its own strange logic, simply impossible. It found the one true weakness every target possessed, and it exploited that weakness with a precision nothing else in the galaxy could match. "Then it hasn't found our weakness yet," I said, when Peter shared this with the rest of us gathered in the command bunker. "That's why it's waiting." "Maybe," Lucy said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it. "Or maybe it already knows there isn't a weakness to find in any one of us individually. Maybe it's trying to figure out something bigger. What holds us together? What makes this whole colony function as one thing instead of just a collection of separate people trying to survive?" I did not have an answer for that, and looking around the room at the faces of people who had become something closer to family over these long, strange months, I understood that none of us truly did either. We had never stopped to examine exactly what held us together. We had simply lived it, day after day, choice after choice, without ever needing to name it. On the fourth morning, the vessel opened, and the silence before walked out alone, unarmed as far as our sensors could detect, moving directly toward the center of the colony with a slow, deliberate pace that made every hair on my body stand on end. It did not look the way I expected. After everything Oliven had told us, some part of me had imagined something monstrous, something built entirely for destruction. Instead, the figure that approached us was almost unremarkable, of average height, with pale gray skin and eyes the color of still water, wearing simple dark clothing with no visible weapons, no obvious markers of rank or power. It looked more than anything like an ordinary traveler who had wandered off the road and found themselves somewhere unfamiliar. That, I would come to understand, was exactly the point. Peter, Lucy, and I met it at the edge of the central plaza, flanked by a dozen of our own people, armed and ready, though none of us truly believed our weapons would matter if this operative decided the conversation was over. The silence before stopped a short distance away and simply looked at us, unhurried, patient, its still water eyes moving slowly across each of our faces in turn. "You have been waiting for me," it said finally, its voice quiet, almost gentle, nothing like the cold certainty of the operatives who had come before it. "You expected violence immediately. I find that expectation interesting." "Every other operative the Council sent tried to end this quickly," Peter said. "You didn't." "Because they did not understand what they were facing," the silence before replied. "They approached your species as a calculation to be solved. I do not make that error. I have spent these 3 days observing not your defenses, but your choices, how you speak to each other, how you allocate your limited resources during a crisis, how you treat the operative you hold captive, who by every reasonable calculation should have been destroyed the moment it became a liability rather than an asset." Oliven, who had been brought to the plaza at Peter's insistence, standing quietly under guard near the edge of the gathering, shifted slightly at those words but said nothing. "You kept it alive," the silence before continued, "not because doing so offered you strategic advantage, though I acknowledge it eventually did provide useful information. You kept it alive because ending its existence once it no longer posed a direct threat felt wrong to you. That instinct, more than any weapon you have built or any defense you have organized, is what none of my order has ever properly understood about your species." "Is that the weakness you were looking for?" Lucy asked, her voice steady despite the tension radiating through every person gathered in that plaza. The silence before was quiet for a long moment, its still water eyes settling on her directly. "I was not looking for a weakness," it said. "I was looking for the truth of what you are, so that I could report it accurately to those who sent me. Every operative before me approached this mission as an execution to be completed. I approach it as a question that deserves an honest answer, whatever that answer turns out to be." I did not know what to make of those words, standing there in the cold morning air, surrounded by people I had come to trust with everything I had. Part of me wanted desperately to believe them, to believe that this final, most feared operative had come not to finish what the others had started, but to simply see us clearly for the first time. Another part of me, hardened by everything we had already survived, refused to let my guard down, no matter how gentle its voice sounded. "And if the truth you find isn't what the Council wants to hear," Peter asked, "then I will report it honestly regardless," the silence before said. "That has always been my function, not execution for its own sake, but certainty, delivered without distortion, whatever that certainty costs the one who receives it." It moved then, not toward any of us, but toward the center of the plaza itself, standing alone under the open sky, and I understood, watching it, that whatever was about to happen would not look like any of the fights that had come before it. I require one final demonstration, it said, not of your strength which I have already witnessed, but of the truth beneath it. I will test each of you in turn, not through combat but through choice. What you choose in the moments I create will tell me everything the Council needs to know. What followed was unlike anything I had prepared for, unlike anything any of our weeks of training or fortification had readied us to face. The silence before did not attack. It created situations, small and terrible in their own way, moments of impossible choice designed to reveal exactly what kind of species we truly were beneath every calculation and every defense. It offered Peter a choice between the safety of the entire colony and the life of a single volunteer, deliberately isolated and placed at apparent risk, and watched, unmoving, as Peter refused to accept the framing entirely, organizing a rescue that endangered himself rather than sacrificing either option the silence before had presented. It offered Lucy a chance to end this confrontation immediately, informing her that a single, precise action against its own person would end the encounter permanently, guaranteeing the colony's safety, and watched as she hesitated, not out of fear, but because some part of her refused to become the kind of thing that solved problems through destruction alone, when other paths still remained unexplored. And when it turned to me, standing near the edge of that terrible testing ground, its still water eyes settling on mine with an attention that felt like being truly seen for the first time in my life, it offered me the simplest choice of all. I could end this now, it said quietly. Report to the Council that your species is too dangerous, too unpredictable to be allowed to continue expanding unchecked. Recommend the kind of overwhelming action that would ensure no version of humanity ever threatens the Council's stability again. Or I could report something different. That your species, whatever unpredictability it carries, is not a threat born of malice, but simply a different way of existing in the universe, one built on connection rather than calculation. The choice of which report I deliver depends entirely on what you say to me now, in this moment, with nothing between us but honesty. I stood there a long time before answering, thinking of everything we had survived, everything we had built, everything we had refused to abandon even when every calculation suggested we should. I thought of Thren Vos, paused by a question it could not process, of Keshrin, hesitating over the true meaning of home, of Olaven, standing quietly at the edge of this plaza, alive because we had chosen mercy over efficiency. And I thought, finally, of Peter and Lucy, standing beside me, having just proven with their own choices exactly what kind of people we truly were. We're not asking to be left alone because we're weak, I said finally. We're asking because we understand something your Council seems to have forgotten. Strength isn't about controlling everything you can't predict. It's about trusting each other enough to face what you can't predict together. That's not a weakness. That's the only reason any of us are still standing here at all. The silence before was quiet for a long moment, its still water eyes unreadable, and I braced myself, along with everyone else standing in that plaza, for whatever answer it had decided to give. That, it said finally, is the truth I came to find. It turned without another word and walked back toward its waiting vessel, unhurried, exactly as it had arrived. None of us moved to stop it. None of us fully understood in that moment what had just happened or what it would mean for everything that came after. The vessel departed that same afternoon, leaving Haldor's Reach standing exactly as it had for months, battered but unbroken. Its people gathered together in the open plaza, watching the sky long after the ship had disappeared from view. I do not know, even now, exactly what report the silence before delivered to the Council, or what conversations followed among voices none of us would ever hear directly. What I do know is that no further operatives came for us after that day. What I know is that the human colonies scattered across this sector, once considered a curiosity too small to matter, became something the wider galaxy could no longer simply ignore or dismiss. Some among the Council, we would learn much later, still argued that humanity remained a threat too unpredictable to be trusted, a variable that would need to be addressed eventually, one way or another. Others argued the opposite, that a species capable of teaching even the Council's oldest and most feared operative something it had never understood before deserved, at the very least, the chance to be known rather than simply eliminated. That debate, I understood, was far from finished. It would likely never be finished, not completely, not as long as humanity continued to exist as something the wider galaxy could not fully predict or control. But I stood that evening on the perimeter fence of Haldor's Reach, beside Peter and Lucy, watching the last light fade from a sky that no longer felt quite as distant or as threatening as it once had, and I understood something that none of the Council's calculations could ever properly measure. They had sent their deadliest against us, one after another, each one certain that this small, unremarkable colony would fall exactly the way every other target before it had fallen. None of them had. We had not won because we were stronger, or faster, or better equipped than anything the galaxy's oldest order could bring against us. We had won because we refused, again and again, no matter what it cost us, to stop choosing each other over every calculation that told us we should not. I do not know what the Council will decide to send next, if anything at all. I do not know whether the peace we found that evening will last a lifetime or only a season. What I know is this: whatever comes for us next, whatever the wider galaxy eventually decides we are, we will meet it the same way we met everything that came before. Together and without fear, no matter how impossible the odds appear to be. Because that, more than any weapon or defense we ever built, was the one truth none of the Council's deadliest assassins ever lived long enough to fully understand.